right, thanks, Grant. Thanks, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for your time today. I appreciate it. So my name is Ben Schrag, and I am one of the program directors here in the small business programs at the National Science Foundation. I'm going to talk for I think I have about 30 minutes of kind of canned content, and I don't know whether the technology allows it, but my main goal here is to make sure we can have a dialogue and I can answer questions. Maybe we have to wait till the end of this. Before I dive in here, just a few things about me, quick introduction to me. I've been at the NSF for about 10 years in this role. In my role here, basically my entire job is to help fund and evaluate and fund deep technology startups and try to help them be successful commercially through our programming. And so I've done that for 10 years. Also, prior to NSF, I was a startup founder. Spent 6 years at a semiconductor diagnostic equipment startup that was spun out of some of the work I did in grad school. So for those of you who are working in startups, I've been there. It's been a little while. I'm getting a little gray, but all of myself and my whole team, we all come from backgrounds as parts of startups or startup investors. So really are kind of conversant with where all of you are at or have been. One other thing I'll say is I'm not going to talk about, there's a few things I'm not going to talk about today that you may be interested in. I'm going to try to stay away from getting too prescriptive about how to apply for grant funding. It's probably fairly like, the reality of that is probably fairly like you expected. It's a little bit cumbersome and takes a long time. And if you're interested in applying, there's plenty of information that I'm happy to send you. I'm happy to connect with you afterwards or point you to it. But my main goal today is really to try to give you the very first 10 minutes about what these programs are, if you've never heard of them before, and to try to give you some sense about whether you may or may not be a good fit. Because, as I mentioned, it's a difficult application process, and it's not worth doing even starting unless you're kind of get a sense that you might be a good fit. And I can talk about other ways that we have for you to kind of get feedback from the program before you have to go through a fairly lengthy process. But really what I want to try to talk about is the types of companies that might be appropriate for us and the types of companies that might not, and to give you a sense about where we're coming from when we make funding decisions. So I'm going to start really, really broad. So I work for the National Science Foundation. It's part of the federal government. The federal government, has lots and lots of different agencies, some of which you've heard of and some which you have not. One of the things I want to talk about is this overall program called the Small Business Innovation Research Program. And it does exist across the federal government. It exists at a bunch of different agencies. And I want to just talk about why it exists to give you a sense about what we're trying to get out of it so that you can figure out if you're a good fit for that. And also to give you just a sense about different opportunities that maybe not with NSF, maybe with other agencies that you might want to consider. So the important thing to know about the government is that one of the things the government does a lot of is it does a lot of research and development funding. The government funds I believe it's about $150 billion of R&D, technical, scientific research and development each year. And about half of that is within the government, so done at government agencies by people who are government employees, and about half of that is actually done extramurally, which is to say the government is going to give money out of the government to some external organization to do some kind of R&D work. So the government has always done a lot of R&D funding. And as many of you are probably too young to remember this, I'm too young to remember this, but back in the 1970s, there was a lot of economic uncertainty in the country. And one of the things that Congress and the taxpayers were concerned about was that the government was funding a lot of great science and a lot of new innovation and a lot of new ideas and technologies were being developed. But a lot of those technologies didn't actually make it to the market in the form of new products and services. And so the government was trying to find ways to have more of that funding that it allocates to R&D result in actual impact in the market. And so there's a few things that were done based on that concern, and so in the early 80s, basically our program was created, and it was an act of Congress that basically told all these agencies that were funding this R&D that if they were giving a significant amount of money extramurally, so if they're sending a significant amount of money out the door to external organizations to do research, whether it be universities or big industrial concerns, that they had to set aside a percentage of that to basically go to small businesses with the goal of basically taking more of that technology from the lab to the market. And you can read the legislation if you want, but basically the way it works is that all these agencies that pay for R&D for other things take a percentage of that by law and set it aside for what is now called the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which is where I work. So we call ourselves America's Seed Fund, but fundamentally this is the program that I'll be talking about today. And you can see the goals of the program there, but basically the idea is getting more people involved in entrepreneurship and innovation, helping the government to meet its own needs through the small businesses, helping innovation get into the market, and helping to create economic impacts, like helping to create new companies that are going to create revenues, create jobs, and actually help customers in the market. So if you look at this percentage that is required to be set aside, it's actually a fairly big pot of money every year. The fiscal year 2017, a few years ago, the total budget across the whole government for SBIR was $2.5 billion, and it's actually closer to $3.5 billion this year. So here are all the different agencies that actually are required to have an SBIR program. I haven't talked about the STTR program too much. It's a sister program, and it's very similar. The only real difference is that in addition to a small business being funded, it has to work with a partner, typically a university, as a research partner. But basically, when you see these two acronyms, you should consider the philosophies basically identical. So these 11 agencies all of them have their own different forms of SBIR program, where they have a dedicated program for small businesses to apply for research and development funding, to do not just research, but to do innovation, to basically do work that is going to create new products and services. And unfortunately for you, you have to kind of understand a lot of these agencies from scratch. There's a lot of differences, a lot of different twists and turns, and there's not really a whole lot that you can say that applies to all of them. But I will point out that the top 5 agencies here are all really quite large programs. They're all at least a $200 million annual budget. And so each of these top 5 agencies funds, through small business grants, several hundred companies each per year, with check sizes ranging from $70,000 up to several $1 million. And this is all typically non-dilutive funding. So I'm not going to talk much about any of the agencies other than the NSF, which is what I know. But I would encourage you, you probably understand from some of these agencies kind of roughly what they're interested in, right? You can understand if NASA is probably going to be looking for things related to space. Department of Energy has a certain technical focus. If your company is working in a space that you think might align with some of these agencies' missions, I really encourage you to reach out to their SBIR programs and just see if you can get a sense about whether you might be a fit. One thing I will point out, the agencies on this chart, typically, again, they're going to give you non-dilutive funding. Some of the agencies are going to give you a grant, and some are going to give you a contract. And you can learn more about grants and contracts if you've never worked with them, but you should understand that typically a grant is very flexible and may be something that you can use very flexibly to align with your business. Contracts are typically much more rigid and have deliverables, and they're much more about the agency's needs. And so depending on what your business is trying to do, knowing whether a grant or a contract is part of the funding mechanism is a really important first step when you start to explore these programs. So just as one more set of kind of comments about different government agencies and how they approach the Small Business Innovation Research Program, any of these agencies are going to give you non-dilutive funding. None of them is ever going to take a piece of your company, and none of them is going to give you a loan. They're not going to require paying back the money. So it's going to be typically money that is not going to affect your cap table, and it's not going to be on your balance sheet as a liability or as debt. The funding that they're going to give you for the lion's share of the funding is going to be for technical research and development. So if what your company needs is funding to do other things beyond building a new product that requires not just engineering, but real kind of blue sky or at least uncertain research and development, if you need funding for something else in that, it's probably not something where you're a good fit for these programs. They're looking to have you work on your product or service, and typically it's got to be something that's got some technology and science built into it. Typically, in almost all cases, these agencies are the government, and so they're going to use documents. They're going to evaluate you by having you write things down, and they're going to read them. And they may bring other people in to read them, but basically it's an arm's length process. It's obviously different from traditional investors where it's much more face-to-face, or at least, conversational. It's the government, and because there's a lot of diligence that has to be done, the lead times on decisions are typically pretty long. There is some variability. Some agencies will take a couple months. Some agencies can take up to 9 months or even more to make a decision. And so again, something else for you to do research on to decide whether it makes sense for you. And then the other thing I'll say is that, all these agencies are going to protect the confidentiality and the proprietary aspects of what your company is doing. There are some limited governmental rights to any IP that the government funds and pays for. So if you get funding from the government and you develop new intellectual property, the government does have a march-in right if they feel like there's a national need to use your technology. The government has never actually used the march-in right. They've never actually done this, but technically it is a theoretical claim to use your technology. They can't steal it, they can't give it to somebody else, but they can use it. And so again, it's something that I think is more of a theoretical issue at this point because it has never actually happened. But obviously it's something that is a potential, that there's a potential to happen. And so it's something you should keep in mind. The other thing is that, if you get funding from the government, the taxpayers are basically always told some amount of information about what the government is going to pay for. And so in general, if you get an award, you're going to have some small summary of your project disclosed to the public. And usually those abstracts are obviously going to be something that's not going to reveal any proprietary information, but the government will know that your company is receiving taxpayer funding. And so in some cases, if you really want to be completely stealth mode, that would be something to keep in mind. As far as what varies widely by agencies, a lot of things are very different depending on what agency you're talking to. So the value proposition is probably the most important one, and understanding what the person who's going to decide on your grants or your contract gets out of it, what the agency sees as the value in giving you funding. And so typically speaking, there's a few different common things you see when the government wants to fund one of these awards. For agencies that are actually looking to procure technology, the value proposition is often that the government itself wants to use the product that you're building, and they want to give you money to develop it so that later down the road they can buy it and use it. So for example, the Department of Defense is the biggest SBIR program. They typically are looking to fund you to solve their internal problem, and they're going to give you a very clear, specific understanding about what they want you to do with their funding. Some other agencies have a value proposition that's more about supporting a particular technology area. You can imagine the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Energy, they have a mandate to advance technology and science in a given area of the market and technical area. And so they're going to really look at a specific scientific or technical or intellectual focus to try to evaluate your technology. And then at places like the NSF, like our general focus really is closer to that of an external investor, in the sense that the biggest goal that we look at when we fund a company is really commercial impact, whether the company can actually scale the business and create economic outcomes. So we're looking at this as in the value to us is your successful commercialization of your technology, whether that be getting to market and operating the business, exiting to M&A or whatever it may be. And obviously there's some agencies that have a mix of those different perspectives. Every agency has a list of topics. Topics are something that usually pretty early on you need to start thinking about, because in many agencies, that's a really critical way to understand whether you fit. The topic is basically a list of technology areas or specific types of products or services that the agency specifically is looking for. And some agencies will give you very, very deep, very specific topics where they'll tell you exactly what you need to build to be a good fit. And some agencies will give you a very broad topic where they allow you to decide within a very broad scope what you want to do with the funding. So at the NSF, for example, we have extremely broad topics because we want the companies that we're funding to make that decision and decide what makes sense for their commercial vision, because we're not going to use your product, and so we don't have a specific dog in that fight. The deadline dates and the frequency and how often you can apply, those are all different. Typically, most agencies will have kind of a date once or twice or 3 times a year where you have to apply, right? So there'll be a due date. And then, once you hit that deadline, there will be a waiting period while they decide. But again, you have to learn those all by themselves. The review process can vary a lot. Very often, agencies will bring in external experts to give them advice, and some agencies will actually just use internal staff members to make the decision. And the level of kind of commercial interest, the kind of commercial potential, the kinds of things that investors would look for, the level of value that is assigned varies widely from agencies, right? Some agencies really don't care at all whether your product has a commercial market, and some agencies, it's paramount. And then finally, the deliverables, right? So for some of these awards, there are going to be very strict deliverables that your company is going to promise to try to achieve when they get funded. And so again, in some cases, there can be an actual piece of hardware that you have to deliver. Some cases, you just have to write a report. And so understanding what is going to be expected of you is the last thing that I would recommend that you focus on. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears now. That was really the 10-minute primer on the government-wide Small Business Innovation Research Program. If you have any more detailed questions about that, you should do your own research, but I'm happy to try to give you feedback if you want to reach out after the session. In general, I'm not an expert on most of these programs. My startup did get funding from the NSF, but we didn't work with a lot of the other programs, and there's a lot of different people to know. So I am happy to try to answer questions, but in a lot of cases, I will tell you in advance that I'm going to punt some questions if it's not related to my agency, to the NSF. So I'm gonna focus now really on the National Science Foundation. I think we're kind of an outlier in this group of agencies. We have a fairly different program, and I want to really just stress the key things that I think are important for you to understand that are different. So we have about a $200 million budget each year. And the goal is really to fund deep technology startups that are going to aggressively commercialize and create scalable companies. We're not a customer, and so in that sense, we're more like an investor, as I mentioned. We're looking to have you win in the market, selling your service or your product to somebody who is not us. The $200 million, again, we're going to write checks starting at about $250,000. We have phases of funding, and our first phase is a little over $250,000. Our second phase is $1 million and has the ability to be incremented up to about $1.7 million. So that means we're basically writing new grants, creating new awards to about 400 different small businesses each year. And the small businesses we fund are across the country, right? So any country, any small business in the United States is eligible to apply. We have a very centralized program. We run the program through dedicated full-time program directors. There's 10 of us, and all of us have both a technical background. We all have come from the world of science and technology. We have advanced degrees in science or engineering. We also all have been either startup founders or startup investors, or have otherwise in our prior lives been through the process of taking new science and engineering based innovations and brought them to market. So we're really trying to focus as specialists in this kind of deep technology startup endeavor that many of you hopefully are going through. Our funds are provided as grants. They're provided as grants because they're very flexible. And the goal is to basically allow your company to align our funding with your commercial vision and to show us how our research and development funding can really increase the viability of your company and de-risk your technology. And as I said, the total ask here, the total potential for you to get funding from us is about $2 million. It will be over several years, right? So it'll typically be half year to a year for the first check, and then 2 years to 4 years for the larger check. So the $2 million, if you get it, will be dispersed over several years typically. We basically support, as far as we can tell, a comprehensive list of any technology in any market area where there is the potential for a deep technology innovation, a new product or service that is based on new science, a new discovery, a new engineering innovation, where there's a commercial potential. And so technology areas here, I think, cover a wide variety of markets. We're trying to be exhaustive here, right? So if you don't feel like you fit into any of these areas, we have at the bottom an other topics area where anything that you feel like doesn't fit does fit. So the idea here is that we're not trying to pick and choose what technical areas we're supporting. The goal is to let as many entrepreneurs as possible propose to us what they're trying to do. And each program director does have certain areas that they're responsible for, but it's not important at the beginning of the process for you to know that, because we're going to basically, once you tell us a little about what you're doing, we're going to try to make sure you know who to talk to. So this is a really important slide for those of you who don't know if you're a good fit. We're funding a very specific kind of company. While we don't have a specific focus in terms of what market area or what technology area, we are typically funding pre-seed stage startups. You don't have to be that, but usually that's when you have the type of technical innovation and risk that we're looking for. But really the most important thing to understand whether you're a good fit is for it to understand that we're looking to fund disruptive, risky, unproven technology. And when we say technology, we're not saying technology the way that a lot of startups say technology, which is to say you have some kind of IT function. We mean technology by the idea that it's something that the world may have never seen before because it just got invented in some lab or some garage somewhere. And it doesn't have to be quite that dramatic, but it really is something that is more than just a new way to kind of do software engineering. It has to be something that that is a new technical approach that is usually something that only your team has done. And hopefully that is something that only your team can do because it's so technically tricky, because it's patented, because there's some reason why it's not easy for the next team of engineers or scientists to replicate. So we want there to be this unique differentiated technical approach, and we want that to create an opportunity in the market for you. And we want there to be risk. We want the technology not to be proven yet, because that's what the R&D funding that we're going to provide is for. So we want you to come at the early stage with an unproven technology, tell us why, if it works, it's going to really create an opportunity for you to build a great business. And we want to help you to pay for the technical work that is going to de-risk that technology. That's going to be one piece in your path to market. We're looking, especially because we're funding these kind of brand new products and services, we're looking like any investor for some beginning sense of market traction. Product market fit is, in some cases, you're not there yet. We fund pretty early stage companies, but we're looking for you to have done some homework on the market and trying to understand the customer and the value proposition. We do take most of our companies through a version of the I-Core program, which is an NSF program that is based on the Lean Launchpad, the Steve Blank, Eric Ries method. So we really want people to really be thinking about their customer and their market and their value proposition early. And we're looking for companies that are not just going to try to do R&D as a goal for the company, but where the R&D is geared towards creating a commercial outcome, right? So the R&D is not the end; it's a means to the commercial end for your business. So a few things we don't fund. We don't fund we're not going to fund basic research, even though we're the National Science Foundation. If what you need money to do is to create new knowledge without a sense about why what the commercial impact would be, that's not something that we will fund, but our colleagues, other places within the NSF might be interested in that. If you're just looking to incrementally improve something that exists, that's not risky enough for us. Sorry. If you're in a place where you are on your way, even if you still have a lot of R&D to be done, if we don't see that our funding is going to really move the needle for your company, that's typically something where it might not be a good fit. So if your company has raised $50 million in private capital, we start to ask the question as to why our $2 million is going to make a big difference, right? So in most cases, we're funding companies where we're the first money in or we're among the first money into the company, because we can really see a catalytic effect there. And we won't actually pay for you to do an evaluation or a study of an existing technology or product, right? If we can't see that you're actually making fundamental changes and improvements to the products during our award, we won't pay for you to basically to take an existing proven set products and to study it. I've mentioned some of this, but just to give you some data behind our portfolio, this is again averaged around the last couple of years, and it's around the companies that receive the first phase of funding, which is where you have to start. So again, most of the companies we fund are young, small companies, and most of them have never gotten a government grant before. That's the most important thing. So I really want to stress, we are not looking for you to be an expert in working with the government. In fact, that's in some cases counterproductive. So I would really encourage you, if you don't know anything about the government, that's probably a feature and not a bug for us. So I would encourage you not to be scared away by the fact that there is some bureaucracy involved. And the other good news is that while we are funding pretty risky, pretty early stage companies with a lot of things to do, once we fund companies, they tend to have pretty good commercial outcomes. So since 2014, we've invested through our program a little over $1 billion across all of our funding rounds, all of our companies. But over that same time period, our companies have raised, I believe it's almost $10 billion in follow-on, just institutional financing. And so our funding does tend to correlate pretty well with strong private capital. So that's one of our goals of our program, is to set you up better, not just technically, but also commercially, to raise the next funding rounds. Because one of the things that is true about the kinds of companies we fund is that because of the deep technology aspect, you're typically not going to be able to go all the way to market and be done with just our funding alone. So there's almost always some other funding that has to come in behind us to make you successful. I have a couple of examples just to give you a sense of some of our portfolio companies and the types of things that we fund. So Opus 12 is a Stanford spinout that basically takes carbon dioxide and creates basically chemicals from carbon dioxide instead of creating them from petroleum, which is oftentimes what they're created from. So it's a new kind of catalytic chemical method. And again, there's a market opportunity there to create commodity chemicals and to make a profit. And there's also a big societal impact there, which is another thing we really focus on. Is, sometimes just making a lot of money is a good enough impact for us, but a lot of times if you have a smaller market size, but a really strong societal impact, environmental impact, educational impact, that is something that we very much are looking for. Unspun, another company, this is an additive manufacturing company. They scan your body and they create clothes, they create jeans. And so I bring this one up because it's a cool technology, but also because it's jeans. It's not a game-changing impact in terms of somehow changing the world by solving some big global challenge. But it's an important market, and it's a new approach to basically building something that everybody knows what it is, that has the potential to create really strong corporate outcomes. And finally, there's a video here. I'm not sure what's coming through. Finally, there's a I wanted to put an IT company here. This is a software company called Thousand Eyes. And I wanted to put in an IT company here because we do fund software companies, which I suspect a lot of you are, but we only are really funding IT companies when there is some real deep disruptive innovation in the IT space, right? So a lot of IT companies that could be great companies are not necessarily a fit for us because they're building something that they know, given enough time and money, is something that can be built. And so if you're sure you can build what you want, if there's no risk that it might not work at all, that's usually a sign that you're not a good fit for us. And a lot of IT companies, they know that they can build what they're looking to build, right? In a lot of software cases, if you can envision it, you can build it. But there are a lot of software companies also that have some kind of new innovation, new algorithm, new kind of cutting edge machine learning or AI, where there is technical risk, and we do fund companies in that area. So Thousand Eyes is an example of a company that is a software, that is a SaaS company, but basically has this really deep new technical approach using network tomography and synthetic monitoring probes. The other reason I wanted to bring up Thousand Eyes is because, you know, one of the hallmarks of the kinds of companies that we fund is that they take a long time to get to market. So even though this is a software company and therefore should be, you know, relatively fast compared to some of the things that we fund, you can see in the top of my slide here, we funded this company to get them started in the beginning of 2010. And this bottom headline is from a few weeks ago, right? So this company basically took 10 years to kind of build out their product and get enough traction to get to the exit. And a lot of other companies take longer than 10 years. So that's one of the things that we are okay with, right? A lot of investors are not going to look at a decade or 15-year timeline as acceptable. We are patient capital. We understand that if in some cases it's going to take 10 or 12 or 15 years, and that's okay with us as long as once our funding is over, you have somebody else to pay the bills to get you through that decade or more of development. So if you're interested, there's a pretty easy way to get some more feedback without having to commit a huge amount of time. We have a process called the project pitch that you can go to and submit on our website. It's the first step you have to go through anyway. So if you're going to submit to us, this is something you'd have to do anyway. But if you're not sure you're going to submit, I would encourage you to fill it out. It's about 2 or 3 pages. It's really about 1,000 words of content. It's really trying to just get a very quick sense about who you are, what you're doing, and what you need money for. Once you submit it, it'll go to our program directors. They'll review it and they'll respond in up to 3 weeks, but typically it's about a week on average. And really, it's just about them giving you a sense about if there is a good fit, if there's not a good fit, and if we think there might be a fit, to give you some feedback about what to worry about, what to work on. If you do get an invitation based on the pitch, you are going to have to go through a full proposal process, which involves government registrations and which can take, once you submit it, it'll take a few months, 3 or 4 months to get a decision. So this is a relatively slow process, but before you dive into the months-long process, I really do recommend the project pitch because it is intended for people who don't know about the program to start to feel it out. We have full proposal windows that are open all the time. They basically have a quarterly schedule, and if you want to know about the kind of gritty details of the program and how to submit a full proposal, you should Google our solicitations. If you Google the numbers at the bottom here, the NSF 20-527, 528, you will get to the solicitation that'll give you all the gory detail on how the full proposal looks if you're interested in seeing that. But you don't have to know that yet, but if you want to, feel free to go ahead and take a look. And the project pitch, just so you know, and you can get this on our website, but just so you know what we're going to ask you to provide in this first kind of 2 or 3 pager, it's really just talking about the technical approach, the work that you want us to pay for, the work that you're going to ask us to fund, and then what the market is and who the company is. So pretty standard team technology market process. And these are accepted all year long. You can go to our site and just put them into our portal whenever you're ready. And that's all I have planned. I'm happy to, if there's questions or anything else I can expand upon, I'm happy to do that.
Thanks so much, Ben. Lots of money and with a long tail. but it sounds specifically like the NSF, independent of the rest. NSF really is about the exit, then bringing whatever it is you're building to market. Seems to be like your message today.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be an exit. I mean, if your company has an issue with kind of exiting, if that's not your strategy, that's okay. But yeah, the idea is, commercialization means you're solving somebody in the market's problem and they're paying you for it, right? So if we don't see that, then it's not something that we feel is fully successful.
Can you tell me if it's appropriate to dig into some money financials? So is it the NSF's position on the amount of money? Is it really about that? Or is it more about, if you have great financials, but not a great idea, are you going to get funded? Or is it more the opposite? You have a great idea and, we'll work with you on your financials. It's more about the idea section. Kind of where's that balance?
So as far as, I think that the one thing that is the least negotiable for us is the kind of the deep technology piece, the technical approach, because if you don't have like a differentiated technical approach, R&D is maybe not going to build your company that much, right? If you know that given enough funding, your product is going to work, it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a lot of time to kind of go and have to build it out, right? I mean, in today's view about startups, the idea is to get to a minimum viable product, right? And not try to take on technical debt, right? And not try to build too much too fast.
Right.
But if you do have that technical approach that's unproven and risky, then R&D is maybe what you do need to do. So I think that piece is the most non-negotiable piece. As far as the financials and the market side, we do fund companies with pretty modest market sizes, right? Especially if there's some other problem you're solving, right? So the market doesn't, there's certain things the market doesn't price well, right? The market doesn't price environmental impact very well. It's getting better, but the market doesn't price, say, new scientific tools, right? So
sure,
eventually CRISPR will be CRISPR is a big $1 billion new research tool. There's a lot of research tools that are really impactful that just don't have a big market. And so if you have a tool that's going to help scientists and engineers for the next 3 decades to build cool new things and to make discoveries, we don't take, if no one's ever going to buy it, we won't fund you. But if a small number of people will buy it enough to keep the company going and that are going to enable those innovators to do new cool research, then we'll definitely take a look at that.
Heard.
Yeah. So we kind of have a double bottom line in that sense.
That's good to know. That makes sense. The value proposition phrasing from a startup standpoint might be the thing they push forward or discuss more often, so that it's clear to the NSF that here's really what we're bringing, and then they can have a discussion you're saying of where's that sit, how big is that market? Yeah,
I mean the limit on the lower limit on the size of the market is that at some point in time it's going to be so hard to keep the business going that everybody's going to probably rightfully get other jobs. So, at that point in time, obviously we don't want to fund something where it's never going to get to market. But if it's maybe a smaller market, but a very profitable business that can keep everyone engaged and happy, then that's okay. We don't need a billion dollar opportunity the way that a lot of investors do.
Right. All right, so let's go to some questions. We have some coming through, so that's good. Keep the questions or even topics coming. Areas of focus you might want Ben to call out and discuss, or just talk on to kind of hear his perspective about how he thinks about a particular area for the SBIR from the NSF's perspective. Deborah Winfrey asked, in what stage of patent registration does a business need to be in? So maybe you can talk on patents and maybe a couple stages even, maybe review, all right, I've applied, or I've gotten it, or I've had it. How does NSF see patents?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, you don't have to have a patent or even intend to get a patent later. There's plenty of technically differentiated businesses that have a way to defend themselves without using a patent. We probably all know that a lot of software companies now are definitely careful about patenting if they patent at all, just because software patents are kind of in a wild west right now. But if your plan is to patent, you definitely don't have to, a lot of times companies will want to submit a provisional patent. But even some companies we fund that are not even at that stage yet. Usually the companies that we fund are pretty early. They don't have necessarily the financial resources to have filed a full utility patent. And applying to us is not a public disclosure, so it's not going to affect your patent rights. But certainly we are going to ask a question around how do you defend yourself, right? Most of our companies are smaller than their competitors, less well established, and the one thing that they usually use to beat off bigger competitors is some kind of technical approach, and a lot of times that's based on patents. So we are going to ask about the IP strategy going forward, but there's no amount of work that has to be done as kind of a rule. So I would encourage you to err on the side of approaching us before you maybe think you're ready, because I think we are funding companies that are, a lot of companies incorporate to take our award at phase 1. So in some sense, it's hard to be too early in that sense.
So I hear you saying that how do you defend your IP, less the method as the way, more here's the area we want to hear from you about, how are you doing it? That makes sense.
The question in our head is, it's less about, okay, tell me about IP strategy. IP strategy is one of the ways we phrase it, but if you want to back up and think about what itch is that scratching for us, the itch is basically if some other smart team of people decide to try to do the same thing,
right,
why can you do it and they can't, right? And so a patent is one way to do that, but maybe you just have the whiz kids that nobody else has, or maybe you have a head start. And so the idea is obviously later on, once your business gets more mature, you're going to start building barriers to entry for competitors that are not just technology based, but usually when our companies start, that's the only thing they have that's in a barrier to entry for competitors is their innovation, right?
Right.
So we want to see how they're going to protect that until a point where they can build up some more traditional strength.
Christoph asks, do you have to be a U.S. citizen to get approved? I'm a green card holder, permanent resident.
Yeah, so for our program, green card holders and citizens are identical. There's no difference in how they're treated. The companies that apply do have to be US-based small businesses, and you can read about that online, but the way eligibility works is that the company has to be at least 51% owned and 51% operated by US-based individuals, which includes permanent residents. So as long as you have the right to work, you can work on the projects, and as long as your company is majority US owned and operated, you're good to go.
That was easier than I expected. That's nice to hear, honestly.
That's not even, I can't even take credit for that. That's Congress's job. Congress decided that, so thank them.
Thanks, Congress. Maurice asks, is there a preferred entity type? So C Corp, LLC, S Corp?
No, I think the structure of the business has to kind of fit the vision, right? So certainly things can change, right? We don't need everything to be completely settled and finalized when you start. You can make changes along the way. But obviously, if you're going to have to take in, institutional investment, eventually you'll not need to be an LLC. So if you want to come in as an LLC, that's fine. It's obviously a lighter way to get started. We don't have any preference, but we do want to make sure that that you kind of understand if you're not the right structure for what you eventually need to be, you need to be cognizant about what you need to do and what the right structure is, right? So we just want you to be thinking clearly about it. But as long as you're a small business, we do fund LLCs, we fund C Corps and S Corps, and occasionally a sole proprietorship, although sole proprietorships also have their own issues that you'd have to work through.
You do not fund non-for-profits, however, correct?
We don't, yeah, that's legislative, yeah.
So no NPOs, no non-governmental organizations. It has to be some sort of for-profit entity. But as you said, the organizational structure is really about how then you operationalize that.
Yeah. Again, our general philosophy on a lot of these questions is like, if there's no good reason for us to have a strong point of view, we give that flexibility back to the entrepreneur just because
Understood.
That's how it works best. Yeah.
Are there any restrictions on how the grant money is spent? You touched on the contract versus a grant. What Maurice is referring to are hardware versus salaries or capital or equipment. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So in general, no. There's a few things. So in a first phase of funding, when we write our first check, our $250,000 check, the only restriction there is that we don't allow you to buy. We don't allow you to do too much capitalization, right? So if you want to use half of that money to buy a piece of equipment, we usually don't allow that because we want most of the money to go to actual work being done and not just to capitalize your company. But in general, the costs that we allow are any kind of costs that would potentially be needed to allow you to do R&D, right? So salaries, fringe benefits, materials, supplies, facility time, contractors, subawardees, consultants, those are all things that are allowed. When you apply to any of these programs, you're going to give them a budget. How strict the budget is in terms of changing it later is dependent on the agency. At the NSF, we have a huge amount of flexibility where if you need to completely rewrite the budget, that's usually something that can be done. So for most of the cases, when you have a grant, the grant gives you a lot of autonomy to tweak the spending after it. But we are going to ask you when you get to the full proposal stage to tell us how you're going to spend the money, because that's one way for us to kind of get our heads around your project and try to do our evaluation.
Deborah is asked another question, basically kind of looking for some guidance on, should we be looking for grants for this? She listed kind of more of an in-depth conversation of, I guess since this is office hours, maybe that's the expectation, is to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, we can definitely take it offline if it's just about what you're doing. You know, the project pitch is intended to kind of get to the question I think you're asking. So you could do that. But if you wanted to reach out to me, my email address and my phone number are here, and you could just send me an email and I'll send you a link to set up a time on my calendar.
So Deborah or any other attendees, over here is Ben's email. So you can email him directly, and part of what he'll do is literally have a conversation with you about what it is you're working on and kind of help you work through that. Maybe give you some feedback. I don't want to speak for you, Ben. But two, if you want to connect with other attendees or whatnot, you can, in the chat right here, you can drop your email and let other people know where they can find you. If you are working on a project and want some people, or you want some feedback on your project, feel free to share your email, phone number, or LinkedIn link over here in the chat. But if you'd like to reach out to Ben individually, kind of with more in-depth questions, then go ahead and shoot him an email. It looks like bschrag@nsf.gov.
Yeah. And just I've looked at Deborah's kind of summary of what they're doing. We do fund a lot of battery companies. So the key thing, and we can talk about it, but the key thing with this would be if there's still enough risk around the battery, some things that are potentially show-stopping technical risks. If you have that, it's probably a good fit. If the prototype you need to build, if you know you can build it and there's not a lot of risk around it, then it might be too late for us. But we certainly fund lots of battery companies. So definitely it could be in the ballpark.
It is amazing when you look at the graph of batteries getting charged and then their usage and then how it tapers off. When you layer those over the years, it's been amazing, the technology on the speed of it ramping up and then just tabling off, so that, you know, when you're using these things, right, that it'll last at the right voltage all the way till, you know, 0.5%. It's not sluggish for an hour or two. And and that's probably lots of thanks to what the NSF has funded in allowing us to watch our cat video a little longer at full resolution.
That's certainly one of the things that we've seen pretty continuous interest in for years, just because no one has kind of gotten to the holy grail with batteries yet, but they have gotten better.
Right.
Yeah, we actually have one of our recent unicorns is actually a battery company called Silent Nano. They just announced a funding round at $1 billion valuation. So hopefully that means that there's some big impact they can make.
We did a fun battery activity in one of my robotics summer camps with elementary and middle school kids, and we just layered in the insulator and then the anode and the diode, and they laid them all out, and then they rolled it up. Then they had two different ends exposed, and then they connected them, and they could just press on this big batch of tube they just rolled up. It was fun for them to see. Batteries are interesting. I'm geeking out, so I digress. Another question is from Stephanie. Does NSF take into account the investors on startups' cap table when considering funding?
Yeah, I mean, so we take into account everything. We don't necessarily ask for a full cap table. We do want to know some of the contours about who owns the company. So, for example, there's a bunch of ways that the investors on the cap table could affect our evaluation. Having investors who know what they're doing is usually a good thing because it's validating the market opportunity. That's usually most investors only invest if they think there's an opportunity there. So that's usually good. Again, if the investors have put in a huge amount of money, then we'll start to worry about why our money is important. But we also want to make sure that the company is, obviously they have to be eligible. If you're majority owned by investors, then that is actually not, then actually you're not owned by individuals, which is one of the things that the eligibility requires. So if you're majority owned by VCs, by institutions, then actually you become ineligible. But the other thing we do with investors is, investors can add to the strength of the team, right? If they have the right network, if they're involved in the company and they have the right expertise, that's a good thing. The other thing we look for is we want to look for the right structure, right? So looking at the cap table and understanding who owns different pieces of the company and who's calling the shots. There are certain structures that are more conducive to aggressive commercialization than others, right? For example, if you have a person who owns a majority of the shares of the company but is not involved in day-to-day operations, that can be a source of questions for us because that creates a risk, right? So we want to see ideally that your equity is lined up with the people who are going to make the company successful. So I think those are just general ways that I suspect most investors look at the structure of the company to make sure it's in the right structure. That's the way we would probably look at the investors, right, as validation and as the proof of the correct or the incorrect structure and kind of organization of the company. The other thing about investors is that, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The other thing about investors is that, obviously there's investments that are bad deals to take, but a lot of times your willingness to take investment actually says that you may be more willing to do what's right for the company than to kind of hold on to your share, right? So it does say something about the founding team because, as you all probably know, a lot of technical companies are run by, scientists and engineers, and occasionally some of those people are unwilling to let investors in because they want to really control the company, sometimes more than they want it to be successful. So this is the Richard King debate. So in some senses that we also look at that aspect through the lens of the cap table. Sorry to cut you off there, Grant.
No. You were in thought, and I was going to fill in. Mm-hmm. You were just clarifying. Mm-hmm. Want to make sure that we're being respectful of time. Ben, you're going to be around for another little while here?
Yeah, I'm blocked off till 1 Eastern, so if needed, but certainly happy if people would rather take this stuff offline. I'm happy to also give you guys back your time if you want.
So your this hour was basically the session. So mm-hmm. For those folks who are here to listen in and kind of hear what the majority of the things Ben wanted to get out. He's going to be around for another 45 minutes to an hour to answer individual questions. At this point, if you're looking for kind of this session concluded here in a couple minutes on the hour. So feel free to, over here in the chat, share your information, and you can do an email, phone number, LinkedIn link. Ben's email is over here, as well as his phone number, it looks like. So you can definitely connect with him. If you'd like to stay on and continue Q&A with Ben, you're welcome to do that. If you'd like to take it online with the organizers of Detroit Startup Week, follow the hashtag DETSW2020, and that's where you can connect with them. You can connect with each other, the attendees over here in the chat, again, like I said, but to be respectful of everyone's time, if you're looking for the session, we'll conclude that, and we'll just kind of move into the one-on-ones Ben can have with individual people and these open office hours. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Boop. I need to have like a button. Move over. Yeah. So we still have a little over 20 folks in the room. And so there were still some questions. I'm going to scroll back through. Just wanted to give an update to everyone. Moving through the Q&A. Oh, a couple questions, Ben, about minority companies. Are there considerations for the founders themselves and their demographics?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the legislative goals and one of the NSF's fundamental goals is to broaden participation in both science and engineering, and then also in entrepreneurship. So there's a number of ways we do that. We do a lot of partnerships with institutions that have a higher percentage of diverse entrepreneurs. We look at this as part of our review criteria. One of the criteria we have is called broader impact, and one piece of that is broadening participation. So that's something that we bring in external reviewers to give us advice. They'll comment on that, and obviously the program directors will also take that into account. I didn't go into a lot of the kind of tactical things we do during the award, but there's a number of other programs we have that are intended to kind of broaden participation, especially for grantees who are in the program. So we have a postdoctoral diversity fellowship. So we bring in, for our small businesses, we have a program where they can recruit underrepresented postdoctoral students, so people who are, recent PhDs who are underrepresented. And we pay for the postdoc. We pay for them to work at the startup. We also have a partnership where companies can work with HBCUs and CREST institutions, which are Hispanic serving, and they can basically get additional funding to have the small business work with one of those institutions, which obviously is intended to help kind of cross-pollinate, the small business experience, the university expertise, and to make sure that students and faculty who are from those groups have an opportunity to participate in this kind of work. There's some other things as well. I don't want to go too much into all the weeds of all the different programs we have, because it gets a little bit hard to remember. But yeah, this is something that that the NSF has always worked on, and honestly, the entire kind of scientific and engineering enterprise continues to work on. And I think we've done some. We need to do more on that. So certainly there's a number of ways we do that. One of the things that I think is a really easy way for people for any of you, but especially for people who are from underrepresented groups, to kind of get a sense of the program and to make sure that you have the inside feel, is that we do bring in both technical and commercial experts. So people who know certain technology or scientific areas, or people who just know about startups as reviewers. We bring them in to help evaluate applications. So one of the ways that any of you can participate is just to basically send me an email and tell me you're interested in serving. We'll bring you in, we'll compensate you for your time minimally. It's not a lucrative gig, but it's enough to, I think, to cover your time. And you'll be able to see how the process works from the inside and get to know some of us. So if you want to do that, send me a link, send me an email, maybe tell me what you know about, what you're interested in, or maybe send me a resume or send me a link to your LinkedIn page so I know a little bit more about where you best fit, and we can get that set up. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'm happy if there's a specific question around that to go deeper, but yeah, I worry about giving too much.
you, Ben, you're here on Detroit Startup Week. Somehow it came to pass in some conversation that then you got connected to that you should be here to give this info. Is NSF or SBIR in the practice of doing this outreach to get the applications? What does that process look like for this sort of outreach kind of stuff that I think you're doing right now? Like, help us understand what this is.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so our program has, especially recently, done a lot of outreach to, I think, the broader startup ecosystem. This is one example of that. And to places where I think, it's not our normal customers, if you want to think about it that way. Part of it is honestly the question that was just asked about bringing in more diverse participants. The only way to change the mix of participants is to go find people in places you're not generally going. So we've tried to do that with both the legacy startup ecosystem, with organizations that serve underrepresented populations. And so the government doesn't do that usually. I mean, we're, I think, unique or at least unusual in how much of this we do. One of the things that I didn't talk about a whole lot, but you guys can go on the internet and actually search the data about how these awards are made for all the different agencies. And one thing that you'll find is that for a lot of the agencies, the same companies get a lot of the awards. You'll see the same companies in a lot of cases getting many, many awards. That's obviously, there's an advantage to that for some agencies where they know the company, they kind of know their performance, and if they're looking to get them to build a new product for them, they kind of have a more kind of track record that they can count on. Our program is really about launching companies, and so we're not generally going to fund the same company usually more than once, because if you go through the process and we fund you for 5 years, usually either you didn't make it or you made it, and either way, we don't want to necessarily fund you again. Now, sometimes we do fund a company a second time, but we do it dramatically less than other agencies. And so once you do that, it's good because you get to touch more companies, because you're giving only one or maybe 2 awards for each different company. The bad side or the hard side about that is you have to keep bringing the folks into the pipeline. And that's where you get into your question, Grant, which is, if we wanted to fund the same companies, we wouldn't have to do much outreach because they know us and we know them. If we want to fund brand new companies every year, which is kind of our goal, then we need to market ourselves more than the government typically has done, right? If you're a funding agency, a lot of times you don't have a marketing team because people who need funding know you, and your kind of target audience, there's 100% name recognition. So within the community of scientists and engineers at universities, say, who get NSF funding as part of their job, they all know us. So NSF doesn't have to market to them typically. But for our program, the entrepreneurs who are doing this, they don't necessarily know the NSF supports startups, right? I suspect many of you didn't expect at least part of what I told you today. So yeah, we have tried to really be better about marketing and doing outreach in that sense, because we're trying to really broaden the pool of people who know about us.
We were talking a little bit before we came on here, and I had mentioned the first robotics competition, and this global competition that's trying to change culture for young people to celebrate STEM. NSF and NASA are 2, and Department of Defense are 3 federal programs that I know about that are global partners on things like that. Do you know of any more things like, first, I'm putting you on the spot. I don't know if you have an answer for stuff like this. But I guess I know as an individual in a community, right, I try and get involved, and FIRST is one way I do that. And one way that I know about NSF is through FIRST and their global support and partnership with FIRST. Are there some other programs that people might be involved in already that NSF might be involved in as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we do sponsor, we sponsor Techstars, right? So we have other organizations that are usually, the thing we've done recently is mostly oriented towards places where startups kind of live. So thinking a little bit more about the immediate pipeline where like, the company that is going to apply in 6 months might find us. As far as like First Robotics, which is obviously seeding the broader pipeline of, future scientists and engineers, NSF does a lot of that. A lot of that just because of the way NSF is organized ends up not on our specific plate, but kind of as a more broad NSF initiatives. So I think, you all have probably seen there's a lot of educational programming, science and engineering education, citizen science that NSF supports. As far as like engineering specific things like First Robotics, I'm not sure, nothing comes to mind kind of on that particular vein, but you guys all probably know we sponsored like podcasts like Radiolab, which is a science podcast. We sponsored Nova. We sponsored a movie about Antarctica that just came out. So there is some kind of public science visibility stuff that we do. I'm not the deepest expert in that stuff. I probably should know more about it, honestly. But for our program, because we have a very specific kind of project we're looking for, we tend to be more laser focused on rather than seeding the pipeline, because NSF is doing that already, trying to really capture the grad student or postdoc who's right about to launch their company, or the person, the man or woman at the garage who's tinkering with something new, and get them at that kind of proto-venture stage. That's really the goal. So the end of the program I would mention that I think is maybe relevant here is that we have a program called the Innovation Core at NSF, the I-Core, which is created by one of our program directors about 9 years ago now. And it's basically, as I mentioned, it's kind of adapted from the Steve Blank Lean Launchpad method of customer discovery. So NSF has a program to take university teams through that. And it's kind of a feeder for our program, because the goal that is for a scientist or engineer typically, or somebody who's discovered something new, to see if what they've discovered might have a commercial potential using the method of customer discovery. And so we have these I-Core instructors that we fund that basically will take these teams of potential startup teams through 100 customer interviews to figure out if they should form a company. And some cases they do, in some cases they don't. And sometimes when they do form a company, they then go and they get funding from our programs. So that's kind of a near-term pipeline that we can launch. And if any of you are at the stage where you may have a technology in mind, but you're not sure what to do, and you don't want to kind of jump into a company yet, the I-Core is a program I would recommend. There's actually an I-Core node, which is like a center of this program in Michigan at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. So you could reach out to them, or you could reach out to me if you're interested.
I will second that. Being an IU graduate, I went through I-Core, and it was a fantastic program.
Awesome.
For me to, how do I position it? In a way for me to humble myself, right? We took it at the beginning and the end. So IU took us through it at the beginning as a gut check. Right? When you're answering a question where you don't even know the words in the question, it's a super gut check on, all right, I got stuff to learn. And then knowing that stuff's going to come up, and in the end being able to fully wrap your head around the possibilities of answers down the line. That was pretty cool to see. The I-Core program was tough, but in that way it was effective in getting me from wherever I was, right, to where I needed to be.
Awesome. You went through it twice then. Good for you. That's a rare feat. It's like going through a Marine Corps boot camp twice.
Okay. Good. That's interesting to hear from your perspective.
Or so I've heard. I never went through it. I wish I had it with my startup. It was Steve Blank and all those guys. So yeah.
And it, that's kind of interesting that you say that. I wonder if it was when I-Core was being developed, because I went through it, I don't know, 18 years ago. That's before kind of that whole lean stuff came out. Anyway, I-Core, definitely a program. And so you were getting into the pipeline that you guys might fit into is more of the ideas of companies and businesses. and how that situates at a university. How are you guys reaching out to high schools and even middle school programs? I mean, more and more I'm seeing this high school and that high school coming into not just with their teams and TSA or their DECA, they're starting an entrepreneurship program where kids are making and starting companies, and middle school programs now. Is that something you guys are starting to see at the top of your funnel?
We're definitely starting to think about that. I mean, so there's a really fabulous public high school here in where I live called the Thomas Jefferson High School of Science and Technology, and it's a magnet school, and I think was rated the best public high school in the country, and it's, again, all the smartest kids in science and technology from around the area can apply for it. So I used to go and talk at their career day, and I got a little bit afraid of talking to these kids because of how much smarter than me they were. So I would bring in kind of, okay, here's what it's like. Here's what I did at my startup, and here's kind of what our program does. And they'd all be like, oh, I already sold my first company, these high school juniors or whatever. So there certainly is a lot of talent to tap there. We definitely need to do better about that. The trick with high schools and even with undergrads is that the question is basically, we need this technology piece. And in a lot of cases, these folks don't quite have the technology-based business yet, right? They're still kind of learning about the science and engineering fundamentals that they would need. But, we are trying to think about social media, trying to do things like, we've considered doing like AMAs on Reddit, things like that to try to get to a different audience. So it's definitely something we're working on. We are still early in that one.
Interesting. That's a clarifying perspective that, yeah, they might be starting business companies, but they're necessarily figuring out those basics. And so what NSF is looking for is this fundamental shift in a technology. So they may or may not be there.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, it's interesting. We do have a number of undergrads. Like there's actually an IU, there's an IU spinout that's one of my portfolio companies that was started by a couple undergrads called the B Corp. If you know Ellie and Wyatt.
I know Ellie, yeah.
Yeah.
Small world.
Yeah, so I can't remember if it was her I was talking to somebody last week. She was one of the people I was talking to, but I can't remember if it was her. But as far as the university network definitely brings our opportunity in front of some undergrads. But I think these days there's actually a lot more focus for universities to be more kind of aggressive and innovative about entrepreneurship on campus. So I think we're also trying to we do have a lot of relationships with like the campus-based entrepreneurship. So VentureWell is one organization that does a lot of kind of undergraduate entrepreneurship. And again, the question there is that there's a lot of great people who want to be entrepreneurs. The question there is, where does the technology come from?
Right. Like I could start a company.
A lot of times that's kind of locked into the faculty member or the lab, and it's a little bit harder for the undergrad to take it and run with it. But when that happens, that's great. But yeah, that's definitely something that I think is an opportunity for us because of how much more universities are doing about entrepreneurship.
So that's a great topic to kind of bring up, is those commercialization departments, engines, areas within universities as they're trying to pull out of the research some commercialization thing, whatever that looks like. Do you see NSF and the SBIR as a backer, a funder of that, rather than a competitor?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see us as a competitor to much of anything, honestly. If we're competing for funding, or again, we want to attract great teams, but I don't think us attracting a great team stops them from doing anything else. Obviously, with investors, there's only so much equity to go around, so that happens. But since we don't take equity, I think we don't have to worry about that. I think when I talked about the way this program was formed, it was really created to tell all these agencies that are funding this research that you have to take some piece of that and actually think about what happens after the research, what happens to get it into the world. And so I think in some sense that means we're complementary to the research, and we're the next step. And some research does not have commercial impact and does not intend it to, and that's fine. And not every piece of research has to become a new company. And a small business isn't even necessarily the only way to get it to the market, right? There's a lot of other ways to do it. But to have an opportunity when it does turn out that there's new research that, so a lot of times we do look to see if our companies are getting the fundamental idea was funded by the basic research side of NSF. That's a really important thing for us to know, because it says that we're helping to kind of fulfill that core mission of the program.
I'm gonna throw a curveball at you a little bit.
Okay. Give me 1 second. I'm going to close the door, which somehow got opened by my daughter. 1 second. Sorry about that. I'm back.
All right. So the Green-gineers, the Green Scapers. The Green Scapers are a FLL team out of Canton, Michigan. And they are finalists for the Global Innovation Award sponsored by Disney. So these are, what's FLL? It's 4th through 8th grade. 4th through 8th graders. And the theme this year for robotics was cities, building up, rise. And they have to define a problem, and they have to come up with an actual solution to solve it. So I'm curious, the NSF, via Ben, perspective on an idea like this applying for an SBIR. When deciding on a problem for this year's challenge, the team conducted a survey of over 200 members of their community. In the future cities, we need plants for environmental and health benefits. However, some find it hard to keep their plants alive due to different watering needs for different plants. Greenscaper is a smart plant watering system that can water your home's plants automatically or alert the user in real time when a plant needs water via display or email. It detects the soil moisture level for each plant using a soil moisture sensor and compares those sensor readings to each plant's watering requirements. The Greenscaper is designed to scale up to 64 plants, and so it's customizable based on the user's needs. I've seen a lot of watering systems. I've seen, soil-based. Is that an example? I'm plucking one out that's relative to Detroit. If they made that system, is that technology enough, or am I giving you enough?
Yeah, no, I think we'd have to see that, taking a sensor that exists off the shelf and then just doing some kind of straightforward engineering is probably not quite enough for us.
Okay.
If there was some way of taking multiple sensors and doing something tricky with them that is not kind of relatively straightforward, maybe. I certainly have killed enough plants in my time to be an enthusiastic customer. So I'm not saying, I think it's a great business idea. The other thing that we would look at, I think in the case of these, sounds like middle school students, would be, eventually somebody has to work for the company. I'm not sure who can work, right? So we'd have to see, who's gonna. We also don't want people to drop out. We don't necessarily, some people do drop out, but we're a little bit sensitive about encouraging people to drop out of school.
Yeah, right.
So we'd have to try to also just try to figure out how the company would go forward.
Is there an age requirement at all?
Well, there's an age requirement in the sense that the people who are paid by us have to be employees, and there's legal requirements about who can be an employee. I don't know if it's an age requirement there, but I think there's a minimum age to be employed as a labor law thing. I'm not sure what the rule is. So we would just need to see that the labor laws were being followed. To have to pay people through this. One thing that is a requirement of the program is that the person running the project does have to be kind of spending a majority of their time at the company, just so that we have somebody who we know is going to really be focused on the project. That doesn't mean they have to be spending all their time on our project, but they have to be. Right. They can't be only spending 1 day a week at the company, just because. Just historically speaking, because of how hard it is to get these deep technology companies going, we need to see a minimum level of kind of commitment to it, investment in it. So if we could find a way that people could do that and not have to miss their middle school classes. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that would be the other thing we would look at. Yeah.
I would love to dig more into that, and I'm going to do my own research to see if there's already some guidelines there that I'm digging into that are so outside of the norm that wouldn't be appropriate to be top of mind. Nevertheless, as more and more of those programs start, between 13 and 18 years old or under 13, what do the requirements look like when those people are either starting a company or they're working for a company that they had their parents start because they're literally just not even 18 and able to do it. They're the ones with the technology experience of, I'm meeting students who have been coding for 5 years in middle school. They genuinely have 5 years of coding experience. These robots. Hopefully, you guys start to see a surge on your end of people coming into college who have 5-10 years of coding experience. That's kind of a dream of mine. I don't know how we got here.
Well, I certainly can compare, a lot of our grantees. I mean, we have all kinds of grantees demographically, but there's a lot of them that are recent graduates, whether it be undergrad or grad students. That tends to be a rich vein for us. And I certainly can see that since I was 26, I think was when I got my Phase 1 award, and I was a grantee of this program.
Sure.
I certainly can see how much smarter they are than I was and how much more they had learned, right? I did some of that, but I was coding on a Commodore 64. And so it's just like, yeah, these kids are very impressive. So yeah, but I do think that there's definitely not a minimum age as far as being smart and engaged and with it enough to do it. I think a lot of it has to do with you're either finishing school or you're not eligible to work or you don't want to have a full-time job. Those are the main things that I think tend to be the things we have to worry about with folks who are really early career. Let's put it that way.
I like that. We got a couple more questions in the Q&A come through. Stephanie asks, is NSF shifting any investments due to COVID?
Yeah, so we actually had for a couple of months, we had an open call for just kind of highlighting the need for kind of technical projects that are going to directly impact COVID. We kind of created a fast-tracked mechanism if you had something that's going to really impact the COVID health crisis. It's still basically the same program contours, the same amount of money and the same kind of general rules, but we kind of made a fast-track process. We made it kind of more open and more flexible if you had an answer for COVID. So we had that open for a few weeks, and we're still accepting proposals, but excuse me one second. Sorry about that. So we certainly have an open solicitation for almost anything that would solve COVID issues. Sorry, I can't talk right now. Excuse me.
Hey. The realities of our time. I have a screen behind me showing our nice virtual background.
Sorry about that.
Your projection.
No worries. And I just have to tell you the incredibly critical issue that just interrupted me was that my daughter wanted to remember the name of the thing that smooths the ice, which is a Zamboni. She couldn't remember the word. So that was the critical issue where I just interrupted myself for.
Reality of our day.
Yes.
I was just explaining how my computer, this is my virtual background on this screen behind me. Mm-hmm. And on one of my sessions, my cats loved the tassels on the end. So the image was just doing this the whole time. And that's where we are. And that's totally fine.
Yeah.
People are people. It's a nice reminder.
Yeah. Sorry. So yeah, for COVID, we are kind of definitely calling out if people have technology that is maybe a little closer to market than typically what we fund that is going to maybe impact COVID in the next 12 to 18 months. It has the potential to do that. assuming that the R&D works out. We do have definitely a lot of interest in that. I think we have enough budget of flexibility in our budget that we're not allocating a specific budget to COVID, but we do anticipate making a few dozen awards probably related directly to COVID. So I don't know what the numbers will be. If we get more that we like, we have the flexibility with our legacy budget to fund that. So we're not. I think we're trying to again be inclusive and let anybody or continue to accept proposals on any topic, but also to try to give special speed to the review for COVID because COVID is time sensitive. So that opportunity was open to kind of start the process for a few months. We got so much interest that just based on the budgetary concerns, the overall budgetary concerns, that we closed the window, but we are still evaluating several hundred proposals related to COVID that some of them we've already decided, the rest of them will be decided throughout this summer. So I don't think we're I think as far as the perspective of, do I have a better or worse chance of getting funding because of COVID? I don't think there'll be a huge change in the kind of chances. I do think if you have something that's related to COVID and that maybe is slightly less kind of long-term than we normally look at, you could think about applying for that. But I think that most of our investments for our legacy topics will continue to be about what they have been.
Thank you for doing the fast track. I mean, as literally a human in the world right now, I appreciate that you guys stepped up and realized that it's a thing that, why not? We're doing some funding. Let's kind of get it going here. So thank you.
Yeah, that's right. We definitely, we talked about this before we started, but our funding is definitely counter-cyclical in some sense. So the economy gets worse, we tend to get more interest. And so we are trying to really double our efforts to make sure that folks who maybe can't raise funding other ways get a quick response.
Another question we have, how do you see the grant funding versus private venture funding evolve over the next 6 months? Oh, this is an investment question over the kind of the landscape. So over the next 6 months, how do you see grant funding versus private venture funding evolve? Wow, you can go a lot of different ways with that one.
Yeah, so I can tell you, first of all, with our budget, our budget is set each year by Congress. So who knows, we have no guarantee about anything for next fiscal year, but for the last 15 to 20 years, our budget has seen pretty substantial kind of steady increases, nothing dramatic, but we've gone from, I think of the SBIR budget in 2009, the year I got here, was in about 100 million, and it's 202 million last year. So it doubled over the last decade or so. Congress could do anything. I'm not going to speculate on what they're going to do for next year, but we've never seen a decrease in our budget within our program, at least. And so, there's obviously a lot of proposals out there to add stimulus funding in different ways, but in general, our funding sees a few percent increase. That's been the case in most years over the prior year. So that would be the grant funding, I suspect, will be about what it's been, unless Congress does something dramatic. As far as private venture funding, again, I can't, I can tell you what I've seen so far. I don't want to speculate, but we do track fundraising for our portfolio companies. And so all I can really comment on is the specific kind of company we fund, which is, again, deep technology, capital intensive, the kind of company we fund. What we have seen since March for the companies that we're tracking about 2,000 of them, is definitely a decrease in private funding rounds. Most of that has been kind of at the Series A stage that I can tell. I can't remember, but follow-on rounds, Series C, D, E, those ones look like they're happening about as often as they ever have. So the rounds that are starting to get away from VCs and towards kind of different kinds of investors in some cases, they seem to be more or less what they were. We are seeing a lot fewer kind of Series A type investments where you're getting your first institutional funding. Because I think VCs are, I've been told this by a couple of folks, but the few folks that I've talked to have said that they're basically less likely to fund a brand new company, partly just because they're being conservative and partly because a lot of the diligence that they would normally do is hard to do without being able to travel. So for right now, what we've seen in the first 3 months of this is really a decrease in the kind of initial investment by equity, by institutional investors. As far as angel investors, which are a big source of funding for our companies, I don't have enough data on that to know for sure, but I've heard of a few anecdotes from my portfolio companies of angels having walked away from deals that might have otherwise gotten done. So that's what I've seen so far. Going forward is anybody's guess, I suspect.
As far as the funding deals, that makes sense as a priority, especially for you guys and where they're going and where they're getting the funding and things. The nature or the methods by which connections are being made and applications are coming in, I'm guessing won't evolve much. You guys have primarily an online document-based system, right? I mean, you're not necessarily going to meetups and hawking the SBIR grant, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, we would have been in Detroit this week, so that has changed. But yeah, as far as the official process of applying for funding, it is pretty online, and so we've seen a lot more interest again because we're countercyclical. So I think from our point of view, it's not going to change that much. Our diligence is doable without meeting you, at least without meeting you in person.
What are some things that early on you get lots of questions about? Are there some top of mind issues that might be next step to what you said in your opening that might help orient people or tools to direct people to that you kind of wish you had a blog post of just those are the things because you're answering them?
Yeah, no, I think the main things that people spend a lot of time figuring out is just kind of our investment thesis that I mentioned. And so the idea that what we care about as far as what a company does to be successful in our eyes, which I think I talked about, and specifically how you narrow down the world of American startups, which are small businesses, which are all technically eligible for us, to the universe of companies that are really a good fit for us. And again, it's about that core technical piece at the heart of your product or service that is unique and differentiable, and typically is based on some new science or some new engineering thing that you came up with or thought about that no one else could do. So a lot of questions at the beginning focus on the fit of a particular project. A lot of people think you have to be in a given technology area or solving a given problem, which is true for a lot of other agencies, but for us, it really is that, or the best way to think about us is, again, that technology focus plus a lot of the same things that early stage investors look for. That's kind of the combination of things we're looking for, right? So a lot of the commercial side of things that we look at in phase one is just, again, the types of indicators that a very early stage startup can throw off that make you think that they may be successful later, which is, again, just basically having founders who are coachable and committed and have high integrity and have the right structure, and people are talking to the market and engaging with customers and getting good signals from the market. So those are the things that I think just to convey as far as a really common thing that we talk about. The other thing is around just understanding, like, is this a loan? Is this an equity position? What do you do with my IP? And understanding, like, when you get a grant, what are the strings that are attached? And so, as I mentioned, there's not a lot of strings attached to us. There is this theoretical IP right that we have that is, I think, that I've never seen come into play, that I don't think has come into play. And then, of course, there's some reports that you have to write for us if you get a grant. But in general, we don't, there's not as many strings, there's almost no strings attached, whereas people think there might be. So yeah, those are the two things that come to mind as really common things.
You guys invest in the Boring Company or SpaceX?
I don't think so. I think, and I guess that's an interesting case study because you have a company coming in with a lot of deep pockets already, and again, that may get back into the case that I talked about, where if they have a war chest already,
Right.
it may be something where is our money something Elon Musk really needs?
Right.
But we have had, we do have serial entrepreneurs come to us and support their companies, even though they probably have reasonable resources. So that's always kind of a gray area. It's having a serial entrepreneur is great. That's an indicator that is an indicator of potential success. But obviously it makes our funding a little bit less impactful. So different program directors, there's 10 of us. We all have our different way to kind of break down all these multiple factors. But I think we all do think about, when is a company too established? When is a company too well funded? When is a company too de-risked for us? And I think depending on the field, there's different answers to that, just because software companies have different risks than robotics companies, for example.
I can't imagine you go out and you tell a company, hey, we'd like to invest in you. And it's not a, hey, here it is, take my money, because there is a process. So you're helping people through the process and helping them realize that they're a good candidate.
Mm-hmm.
It's less I have a check that I want to invest in you, so go do your thing. It's a lot of this orienting and convincing and helping them understand they're a good candidate.
Yeah, that's definitely another thing that that kind of the cold outreach. I mean, I think with the government, I think you're in a position where you can kind of do a cold outreach, and it's not as weird as it would be, just because I'm representing my country, right? I mean, it's and so I think people feel a little bit more confident with like the kind of unsolicited email promising something that's too good to be true. So, but You're right, we wouldn't promise anything, but we do run across companies, and there's a video of this online somewhere. There's a company called Bluefin Labs that spun out of the MIT Media Lab, was funded by us, and eventually got acquired by Twitter. And I think actually the guy who founded that is now the head of the MIT Media Lab, a guy named Deb Roy. But there's an actual story online where after he got bought by Twitter, he told the story about how the company got started. And one of the things he talks about in that, and I think it was a mass challenge event that they put on. If you guys want to look it up, if it's still up there, it used to be.
The Bluefin Media Lab?
Bluefin Labs, yeah.
Bluefin Labs.
Because the sushi restaurant, they came up with the idea, was called Bluefin Sushi or something, and I can't remember. But he basically said that he was just Deb Roy, he's an academic who's doing research, and he published something in Tech Review, some research. One of our program directors, actually the guy, Earl Arkalich, the guy who created iCore, he saw it and he thought it was a really interesting from the point of view of a commercial impact. So he actually just sent Deb an email and said, hey, this is cool technology. If you ever take it out of the lab, give me a call. And so Deb actually showed the email Errol sent him, and when he presented this whole story, and then he presented the emails that came after, and there was like an email from him to his grad student saying, hey, you want to start a company? And the grad student replying back saying, heavy. And like, this whole story about basically how they first got this idea just because he like sent this one kind of throwaway email. So we do send emails like that occasionally. Again, we can't promise anything. And, when you do send an email like that and somebody applies and they don't get funded, you feel a little bit bad. But I do think just because our program is so hard to understand, that I think it's important for us to at least, somebody has never heard of us and they have no idea that the government funds startups. Sometimes there's really no other way to do it, to at least give them the first 5 seconds that we exist, and then just let them decide from there if they want to take it further. So yeah, occasionally we'll run into companies that seem like they could be such a good fit just because there's something about the technology that it's unproven. There's obviously an impact from the commercial side that will reach out. But yeah, you have to be a little bit, you have to be fairly careful.
Are some of the other managing directors in the practice of seeing an opportunity in an industry or, and then finding someone or knowing of someone who could do that and making that connection, saying, hey, we're seeing this in this sector. Do you guys want to build it? We'll fund it. Is that a part of a process too?
I don't think that happens that often. I think we try not to be, a lot of other agencies are trying to predict what topics are going to be the big startup area and then trying to like get it in front of those. And I think that's
Sure.
fine. I think that's good. I think with the government it's a little bit risky just because we're trying to basically be inclusive, right? We serve the entire
Right.
country. Um, and if we start to kind of make predictions, first of all, we're trying, then we're in a game where there's probably people who are better than us, right? I mean, again, that's not what we're the best in the world at. So we definitely try to see if a new topic is coming, right? If say quantum computing been around for a
Right.
while, but all of a sudden it's a big topic. So when we started to see more interest in that, we created a separate topic just so that we could show that we're open for business in that area, just because we knew there
Okay.
would be more companies formed in that area. But again, our topics are kind of like there's a laundry list of them. So it wasn't like we were creating that topic because we favored that topic. We just created it to show
It's
to
open.
people that, hey, there is a place for you here. But yeah, my sense is that if we get into the idea that we're trying to focus on a particular technology or market, we're losing something. We're taking some of the freedom away from the entrepreneur to pursue what they have a passion for.
Right.
So,
Right.
even in a little way, we're very sensitive about trying to be inclusive, both from demographics of the company to technology to market area. But one thing we also have noticed is that sometimes certainly by the time we know there's a new field of technology that's happening, the best companies in that field have sometimes already been past us, right? And so if we wait to kind of create a topic that they can apply to, we've missed the real unicorn companies. So for
Right.
example, synthetic biology is a big area now. Everybody's using microbes to make everything. The big companies in that space, we funded a lot of them, but we funded them, and the biggest ones are the ones we funded a lot of times earliest because they were early. So like Ginkgo Bioworks, Bolt Threads, like some of these companies that were getting funding from us in 2008, 2009. Synthetic biology wasn't a thing I don't think people were talking about outside of academia at that time. And so when those companies got funded by us, we had a synthetic biology topic, but back then we didn't because we hadn't kind of seen this flood coming of companies.
Right.
And so
Right.
those companies were funded under other topics because they fit into other topics. And so it's good that we had a topic broad enough that they could fit themselves in. So even though they probably thought of themselves as a synthetic biology company, we hadn't yet gotten smart enough to realize that's what we should call it.
Heard.
But they got funded as materials companies or chemical companies or biology companies under our other topics. So again, that's the reason why we really are trying to create a set of topics where everybody fits somewhere.
Do you guys disclose all of the companies you've invested in?
Yeah. Everything in the government that gets money, any external organization, there's a record of.
So if someone is interested in SBIR, one, there's documentation on the process. Two, there's the topics of all the areas you guys want to invest in. But three, there's also a history of the companies you have invested in. And so that might be a good place for some people to start as well, of what has happened in the past and that's been successful. And can I map kind of what I'm doing as a potential applicant to what another company has done?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, our interface is a little bit wonky. It's not kind of like the portfolio page of a VC firm where there's slick logos everywhere. There's a lot of technical detail. Not a lot, but there's more than you'll see on most investors. But if anybody is interested, I think that's a great idea. And there's a way I can send you a link to our award search that actually filters down just to our awardees, where you can just type in keywords and search every award we've ever made, right? So we funded 12,000 awards over our history. So you can go back and you can look up the phase 1 award we made to Qualcomm when they were a small business and see what Qualcomm looked like when they were a few employees. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting backward-looking thing to see.
Right.
The way that these technologies, some of which became big, huge companies, were kind of conveyed when they're brand new.
That would be quite interesting. Is that a link you can pull up while we're here in the chat? Or do you
let
have
me
to
find
dig
it
it up?
here. No, I think I can find it.
That is an interesting, being able to see that from a future perspective, looking back. and then potentially follow up, or if you have some background on a company or organization, knowing what they went through then at various stages to today. That would be quite interesting to see the positioning and then the movement in the market, and then the movement of the technology. I'm sure they weren't saying qubits then.
No, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right. It's all the jargon does change and kind of snap into place at some point. But for a lot of these early companies, they don't really know what to call what they're doing. Let's see. Do I throw this in Q&A or?
In the chat would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Why am I not seeing the chat?
So
here it is.
So you're not going to invest in an investment portfolio. You're not going to invest in an accelerator or a startup studio, right?
We can only invest in the small businesses that are for profit that are actually taking the technology to market. Yeah.
So even if, and I'm digging in just a little bit here to see what the appetite feels like. If there is a new technology around building companies, that's still new technology to you, yes?
If there's innovation, so tools, I'm not funding the miner, but funding the pickaxe. Yeah, occasionally.
Right.
Yeah.
And, okay. So what about, I'm using patent language, right? Using process versus tech. Do you not fund processes, innovative ways of going about things? It's the actual technology that you're really looking for, the tool, the thing itself?
Yeah, again, so we're funding we're paying for R&D. That's the congressional mandate we have. We have to pay for technical research and development. So if there's a process where there is that technical risk and you do need R&D to get rid of that risk, then potentially. The question is really whether certainly some processes in some areas that's a very clear thing about what that would look like, right? If you have a new chemical process, that's absolutely something where you need to do R&D to prove it out.
Right.
If it's more of a process in a sense of kind of a way of doing things, then the question is, what is the technical R&D going to do for you? And so if you can make an argument that technical R&D is the right thing to do to prove that out, then absolutely. So we do fund education. We have an ed tech portfolio, and some of that is entrepreneurial education. If there is some way to use AI to help students better, or to build algorithms to help vet companies, startups or whatever, absolutely, right? So one of the companies we funded, this is not quite what you're asking, but one of the companies we funded was CB Insights, which many people know about. So we funded them to actually build an algorithm to kind of evaluate private companies, the health of private companies, right? And so,
right.
But obviously that was part of their business now. But their data scraping and stuff is their main business. But this kind of algorithm to do something clever to try to do a better evaluation of companies is one kind of IT innovation we might support.
What was the name of that company?
CB Insights.
CB.
If you ever listen to NPR's Marketplace or some of these other kind of economics public presses, you'll hear them mentioned a lot. They're kind of cited a lot as analysis. They do the same thing that PitchBook does. If you know about PitchBook. Yeah, similar things. They do a little.
CB Insights just Crunchbase?
No, so CB is actually, it sounds like it should be. There is a Crunchbase Insights, I think, but I think CB originally stood for Chubby Brain, believe it or not. So I'm glad they changed the name. So
interesting, right? So they, even though it's kind of down that path of helping others help others, nevertheless, what they're doing to help is in itself its own innovation. So that would fall under this.
Yeah, the idea being there that this way that they kind of create the score is a valuable piece of IP that gives them an advantage. It's something that other companies can't present to their customers in doing these kind of analyses, and so it creates a commercial opportunity for them. So that's the way we think about it.
Understood. Well, Ben, we've reached our time. Thank you so much for the insight, your experience, your perspective, and genuinely the day-to-day work you do to bring things to market that are helpful for humanity. It's great to see that we're doing this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks to the folks who stuck around for 2 full hours. I know how busy everybody is, so I especially appreciate that level of commitment. And certainly you have my contact information, so we'd love to hear from you if you have questions.